GOP's 60-year authoritarian plot. Perhaps none dare call it treason, but I do. I mean, you know, now that Donald Trump is openly calling for fascism here in the United States, saying he wants to build concentration camps for millions of people, which includes Democrats and the media, I think it's a good time to kind of look back at the Republican Party and ask the question, how do we get here? How do we end up with a Putin-owned, Russia-loving, fascist, corrupt businessman, billionaire, running for president of the United States with a chance of winning? I was 13 years old in 1964 when my dad gave me a copy of John Stormer's book, None Dare Call It Treason. This was a book that hypothesized that the State Department was filled with communists. And the Goldwater campaign actually had bought over 1 million copies and mailed them to people. They mailed one to my dad. And he gave it to me after he read it. And that book in 1964 was kind of the high watermark of the anti-communist movement in the United States. And it was actually set into place by an earlier book, 1951, by Russell Kirk, called The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot, and by Russell Kirk. And Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind, he lays out this hypothesis that because of the New Deal, because of FDR's policies, FDR, you'll recall, in 1935, legalized trade unions. So people could organize as unions without being shot by police, without being beaten by police, without being killed by their employers, without losing their jobs. Legalized trade unions. And it put into place the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, all these kinds of programs. And basically what Russell Kirk was arguing was that the normal structure of society is that most of the wealth and power, political power of society, is concentrated in a very small number of hands. Traditionally in Europe, it was the king, right, in every country, or the queen and their family, basically, and their little in crowd that held most of the wealth of the country and all of the political power. And Kirk was arguing that this is what's normal for humans. And that what's abnormal for humans is democracy, is a strong middle class. That when he wrote his book in 1951, the middle class had not yet hit 50% of America. But we had the fastest growing and largest middle class in the history of the world at that time as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And Russell Kirk predicted that fast-growing, huge middle class, once it hit a certain threshold, probably 50%, which we hit in the 1960s. This was 1951. Russell Kirk predicted that when we hit that, all hell would break loose. Because middle-class people were not raised with noblesse oblige. They were not raised with the obligations of wealth. They were not raised to be the thoughtful rulers of a country. They're raised to go, me, mine, I want more, according to Russell Kirk. He famously, and he quoted, as I said, Edmund Burke, the British conservative, who said in 1790, the opening chapter of Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind, is titled Edmund Burke. The entire chapter is about Edmund Burke. And this is a quote from Edmund Burke, quote, "The occupation of a hairdresser or a working tallow chandler, a candle maker, cannot be a matter of honor to any person, to say nothing of a number of more servile employments. Such descriptions of men ought not to suffer oppression from the state, but the state suffers oppression if they, either individually or collectively, are permitted to rule. In other words, if they can run for public office or if they can vote." He goes on to say, "In this you think you are combating prejudice, but you are at war with nature, in trying to allow for a middle class." So, Kirk and his followers in 1951 were essentially saying that today's hairdressers and working tallow chandlers, candle makers, the college students, women, working class people, people of color, ever got even close to social and political power at the same level as wealthy white men, there would essentially be a communist revolution in the United States, handing us over to Stalin and his Politburo. Now, Kirk believed this philosophically, but the people who were promoting this were mostly very, very wealthy businessmen who were just really pissed off about the union movement. I mean, you know, at that time, well, it was 1956, so my dad finally got a union job, or maybe 1950. It must have been 1957, because I was 6 years old when he bought his first house, and the house he died in, you know, many years later. And you know, working in a tool and die shop, making enough money, one guy making enough money to buy a house, a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, to buy a new car every 2 years, to take a vacation every year, and to have a good retirement, and to put his kids through school if he'd chosen to. This was, and in fact, he did help out my younger brothers. So, you know, keep in mind, this was a time when racial segregation was legal and brutally enforced. The voting age was 21. Campuses were entirely all male, pretty much. Women couldn't even open a checking account or get a credit card without a husband or brother or father's signature. So throughout the 50s, Kirk and his warnings were not really taken seriously, outside of by Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley Jr. But in the 1960s, what happened was 1961, the birth control pill was legalized. 66, we got the war in Vietnam. By 67, all hell was breaking loose. The feminist movement, which you could track back to the birth control pill being legalized, was full-blown. Women were literally burning their bras in the streets. The anti-war movement was full-blown. Young men were burning their draft cards in the streets. The civil rights movement was full-blown. In some cities, black people protesting police violence against unarmed black people were literally burning the cities in the streets. Gay people were having a moment. The gay liberation movement was a thing all across the United States. And at that point, Barry Goldwater and the Republicans looked around, and the union movement was just rolling along. There were strikes all over the country, you know, particularly in the 70s, following the Arab oil embargo. And Barry Goldwater and his buddies looked around and said, holy crap, Russell Kirk was right back in 1951. Here we are in the 60s, and we're looking back into the 1950s, and Russell Kirk was right. A middle class is going to destroy this country. It's going to turn us into a communist nation and hand us over to Stalin. I guess by that point it was Khrushchev. And so what did they do about it? They brought in Ronald Reagan in 1981. In the election of 1980, he was sworn into office on January 20th, 1981, and as soon as he took office, he began the Reagan Revolution, what we refer to as the Reagan Revolution, which was literally a war on the middle class. I mean, he massively cut taxes on rich people. He raised taxes on working people 11 times. He cut taxes on rich people from 74% down to 25%. He put a tax on Social Security income. So you got to pay for that, those rich people's taxes, by taxing working class people. So if you got Social Security, all of a sudden you're paying income tax on it. He put an income tax on unemployment income. He put in a mechanism to track and tax tips. You know, all these middle class things that people, you know, money they used to get tax-free now are being taxed. He ended the tax deductibility of credit cards, credit card interest. He ended the tax deductibility of car loan payments. He ended the tax deductibility of student debt interest payments. Again, all used by working class people. He declared war on labor unions. He crushed PATCO in less than a week. His war on labor was so effective that by the end of his and George Bush's presidency, George Bush the senior, you know, at the end of 12 years, he had taken us from a third of us, 33% of us being in unions, down to 10%. And it hit a bottom at 6% a couple years back. It's slowly clawing back. He negotiated NAFTA, which Bill Clinton signed. I mean, you know, it just destroyed the middle class. Had Reagan not destroyed America's unions, the median American income today would be well over $100,000 a year. Minimum wage households would have a family at the minimum wage, working at the minimum wage. If it had kept up with inflation, you'd have a family income of $86,000 a year. 2 minimum wage workers. And a single wage earner would be able to buy a house, a car, send the kids to college, and have a decent retirement like my dad did. Instead, today, the CEOs keep all that money for themselves and their investors. And this destruction of the middle class then caused a whole bunch of middle class, mostly white people, to say, holy cow, what happened? We used to be in the middle class, and now we've got to, we've both got to work to pay the bills, and we can't even do that. Can't even pay the bills. And along comes Donald Trump, who in the Republican primary points out how corrupt the Republican Party is, which was true. He just destroyed them. And then when for the general election against Hillary Clinton, he became a Democrat. He ran to the left of Hillary Clinton. He said he was going to give everybody health care. He was going to give everybody free college. He said he was going to raise taxes on rich people so much that his rich friends wouldn't talk to him. He said he was going to bring our jobs back from overseas. These were all lies. He had no intention of doing any of them. But people bought it. And in 2016, even though he lost by 3 million votes and never should have been president, the Electoral College awarded him the White House, in part because of Vladimir Putin's help. And so now this is how we got to Trump. And this is how we get to fascism. It's because these CEOs back in the 50s wanted to end the union movement.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Because it was cutting into their profits. We'll be right back.